I am Craig Chalquist. I'm Department Chair of East-West Psychology here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And it's my pleasure to start this by introducing a remarkable man. A couple of years ago, I met Ralph and we began working together on a certificate in holistic psychology that's offered from New York Open Center. It's being offered right now, as a matter of fact. It's a hybrid, so it's part in person, once a month trips out to New York City, and part online. And before I had met Ralph, I had heard of him, of course, but I didn't really understand until we started to work together that in addition to being enormously influential in consciousness movement, human potential movement, holistic learning, that Ralph pretty much is those movements. He's a one-man consciousness movement. So what I'm going to do is, this is the short version of kind of a resume of what Ralph's been up to. I managed to get it down to this size so it wouldn't take up all evening for me to read it. But this will give you a little bit of an idea of who we're actually going to hear from tonight. And I should mention too, opencenter.org is the website of New York Open Center, where Ralph is creative director as well as being the co-founder. So Open Center, for those of you who may not have heard of it, is a leading urban institution of holistic learning. About 60,000 people a year go through, and they participate in year-round programs and attend presentations by major figures in writing and speaking on wellness, social and ecological change, inner development, world spiritual traditions, art, creativity, mystery traditions, and a number of other things that you can't do anywhere else. And this is in the heart of Manhattan. So Ralph was born in Wales and grew up there and also in the north of England. And then at the age of 23, he hitchhiked from Vancouver to Machu Picchu. I'm still trying to figure out how you did that. I want to do it. So when I'm on sabbatical, that's what I'll do. He came to the US as a Fulbright scholar in 1970, and he was program director of Omega Institute for Holistic Studies at Rhinebeck, and taught the first fully accredited course in holistic studies at New York University. He has taught and lectured in the US, Canada, the UK, Russia, and Poland. He is an internationally recognized expert in the field of holistic learning and Western wisdom traditions, and as such, he has organized conferences like, and I tried to limit it to just a few, Prague Alchemy and the Hermetic Tradition, the Italian Renaissance and the Esoteric Traditions, Psyche, Spirit, and Addiction, Voluntary Simplicity, the Grail and Arthurian Traditions, the Golden Age of Andalusia, Sufis, Kabbalists, and Christian philosophers in medieval Spain, the Mysteries and Philosophy of Greek Antiquity, an esoteric quest for inner America, the Art of Dying, more recently, and A Quest for Ancient Alexandria, Greco-Egyptian Cradle of Western Esotericism. The Esoteric Quests series of international conferences are key world events in and on the Western tradition, and, no surprise here, they were established by him in 1995, and they're going. So on the literary side, Ralph has edited and introduced the Rosicrucian Enlightenment Revisited, contributed to What Does It Mean to Be Human, edited by Frederick Frank, and he wrote the foreword to The Way of the Wanderer by David Yaden. His story, A Walk on the Wild Side of Tibet, was published in Tibet True Stories. And he has also written for the Huffington Post and Dragonfly Media. Ralph has been on NPR, the BBC World Service, Voice of America, CBS Nightwatch, RAI TV in Italy, many New York TV and radio stations, Greek and Russian television, and Polish and Czech radio. He's been quoted and written about in the LA Times, the New York Times, Time Magazine, the New York Daily News, and the New York Observer, as well as the New Age Journal and Common Boundary. He edits the award-winning magazine Lapis. And so I'll finish by reading one of his favorite quotations, which when I read it always reminds me of him. This is from Goethe. When the sound, healthy nature of man works as a whole, when he feels himself at one with the world as a great, beautiful, worthy whole, when this harmonious feeling of well-being gives him a pure, free delight, then might the universe, could it consciously feel, deeming itself at the goal, cry out for very joy, and be lost in admiration of the climax of its own development and organization. So we are going out tonight for a little while on the Jeweled Highway, which is the name of his memoir. Please welcome Ralph White.
Well, you know, I've introduced so many people over the years, hundreds, thousands. It's a bit weird to be on the receiving end of it. Was that me? You know, it seems, did I really do those things? I guess somewhere along the way I must have done. But anyway, thank you very much, Craig. That's, here I am in the spotlights. And it's been a real pleasure to work with Craig. As he mentioned, he was directly instrumental in working with me to create or co-create this certificate in holistic psychology at the Open Center, and it's been a real pleasure to do. I actually went through it from start to finish last semester, and it was a beautiful experience. People absolutely loved it, and we even have a graduate from there tonight who liked it so much, but she came out here to do somatic psychology at CIS. So that's Melissa over there. So thank you so much, Melissa, for doing that. And that's really sweet. And you know, I've been a long time fan and admirer of CIS for many years. In fact, Robert McDermott, who I'm sure most of you know, as President Emeritus. Robert actually taught the first ever course at the Open Center that got double figures back in 1984 when the Open Center began. It was a freezing January night and we were down in this desolate part of Soho. It was pitch dark, New York was crazy, it was dangerous. There was nothing lit up south of Houston Street. And Robert McDermott's course, Modern Masters, on Jung, Aurobindo, Steiner, Gandhi, Buber, I think that's who it was. He actually got 11 people coming to the Open Center. And I was so thrilled. I was out there on that fire escape on the bitter January nights, looking in vain for another human being coming around that dark and desolate corner in downtown Manhattan. And so I'll always be grateful to Robert. In fact, I remember Robert telling me in New York when he had just got the position here as president all those years ago. God, that must be 25 years ago. So there's been a nice, sweet connection between the Open Center and CIS ever since then. So I really appreciate it, and it is a pleasure to be here. Okay, so tonight I'm talking about this. Here I am, lighting it. But yeah, it's a memoir. You know, it's something I have been meaning to do for a long time. It has been a strange and, what can I say, bizarre in some respects. It's been a deeply engaging journey. It's been a quest, and that's what the book is called. It's called The Jeweled Highway on the Quest for a Life of Meaning. And it has many dimensions to it, this book. It just came out last week. I just launched it at the Open Center on Tuesday night. So these are the absolute earliest days of getting it off the ground and putting it out there. And instead of introducing other people and organizing conferences, being here in my writer's hat tonight. So I'm really glad to do that. And I'm really happy to see that I think it's 4 people here tonight who worked at the Open Center We have Charles, we have Samantha, we have, who else is here? Right, you'll have to remind me. Jordan, yes. And is it 3 of us? Well, 4 including me, I guess. But it's really sweet to have that New York, San Francisco connection here. I would, of course, be here we are in San Francisco, and the queen of American cities. And of course, New Yorkers would assert that they were the king of American cities. And so we have a nice little alchemical fusion between the alchemical king and queen, I think, with New York and San Francisco, the Open Center and CIIS. That's always the way it seems to me. So it's very sweet. So, so thank you for coming. And I want to, there are so many different aspects of the book that I could go into tonight because it's my life, so, or it's the expurgated version of my life. And so I'm going to tune into what seems to resonate with you guys tonight. But let me just start off with giving you a little bit of the story of what it's about. As Craig said, I was born in Wales. But it wasn't, I was born in 1949 in that period known as austerity Britain. If any of you have looked at that time, the post-war years, it was very grim, it was very dark, it was black, it was impoverished. It was queuing up for tablespoons of cod liver oil and orange juice at school in the morning because the diet was so bad, and the whole country was still on rations when it was playing in bomb sites. It was a difficult world. It looked very grim and grey to me, of course, growing up in that world, but those people, my parents' generation, were just happy to be alive. And but still, you could feel a very oppressive presence at that time. My grandfather was in the thick of the First World War. How he survived that, I have no idea, but he went through 4 years in the trenches. He had his eardrums burst and was mustard gas at the Battle of the Somme, although he did recover his sight eventually. My father was in the thick of the Second World War, went in the second wave of Normandy all the way through to the German surrender. So I grew up surrounded by a feeling of war, death, horror. Because I grew up very aware of the Holocaust. And you look back on the first half of the 20th century and, Stalin's famines, his deliberately engineered famines in the Ukraine in which millions and millions died. And there was not a lot of evidence that I saw growing up for a deeper order to the universe. I was brought up in the Church of Wales as a boy, and then when we moved to the north of England, the Church of England, the American equivalent is the Episcopal Church. And for me, at least, there was no there. I mean, what got me through just my childhood, should we say, my 10, 11, 12, it was a beautiful old 12th century church in the north of England, a little village called Almondbury outside a grimy industrial town called Huddersfield. And it was mentioned in the Doomsday Book from William the Conqueror. So it was a beautiful old 12th century church. But what got me through those early years of my 10, 11, 12 was just watching the light stream in through the stained glass windows, watching the little flakes of dust that had built up for centuries, and just putting up with some vicar droning on and on about Jesus. It didn't have anything to say to me. I mean, by the time I was 12 or 13 years old, it was, my deal with my mother was, okay, I will go to church and get confirmed, but only on one agreement, which is that once I've done that, I'm never going back. And that was the way it was for me. I was a kind of pissed off teenage existentialist in the north of England. In a very, I don't know how many of you have seen those grim kitchen sink dramas, Saturday night and Sunday morning. Any of you know those with Albert Finney, Room at the Top? They painted a world of rough working class existence in the north of England. This is the world's original proletariat. This is where the Industrial Revolution began. I spent my teenage years just down the valley from where the Luddites came from. And you'd have been a Luddite too, if in the early 19th century you'd seen your independent lifestyle, where these people had been weavers for centuries, independent weavers, these barren, hills, the Pennine Hills, the backbone of England. The wind sweeps down. This is about 20 miles south of Bronte country. I'm sure you've read Wuthering Heights, some of you, so where the mists and the fog come down and the gloom. Except this is an industrial world where there's 150 years worth of soot embedded into the buildings. So we all thought that the whole town was jet black. It was just completely covered in layers and layers of soot. And I remember waking up that first morning at the age of 9 and looking down on that valley below and seeing 60 chimneys just pouring smoke into the atmosphere. In those days, it was before the Clean Air Act, as it was passed. So you couldn't even hang out your washing on the line without great thick pieces of black soot landing on them. And we had just come, I was fortunate in spending my childhood in Wales, a lot of it, my very early childhood in the row houses, terraced houses of working class Cardiff, the capital of Wales, but then being up on the beaches of North Wales on the Irish Sea with the beautiful little tidal pools and the sea anemones and the tiny little minnows and hearing the crash of the waves and the cry of the seagulls right next to these two great limestone massifs, the Great Orme and the Little Orme, the Great Worm, as it was called by the Vikings who sailed by, these huge massifs that stuck out into the sea. But we left there at 9 and we moved to this place, Huddersfield, that I was describing, and looking down there and seeing this massive chimneys and smoke and everybody speaking like this. And some of you will remember Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister. You've got to be of a certain age and my age to remember that. But Harold Wilson was a man of the people, Labour Prime Minister in Britain in the 60s, kept Britain out of the Vietnam War. We have a statue of him right at the end, right as you come out. But he was a man of the people, a real lifelong working man's socialist. And that's the kind of world that comes out of it. Because, of course, those Luddites, instead of being able to weave, the only creatures that can live on those wild moorland heaths are the sheep. But they would shear the sheep, bring the wool down, and then these weavers in their big their houses with the big windows, so they could see the light, would weave it, and they maintained an independent life for years. And then, boom, along came the Industrial Revolution. And so they were all herded into mills and factories. In fact, that chapter in the book is called Mills, Darkness and Rain. And of course it's child labor, 9-year-olds working in the mills, it's relentless hours, it's abuse and exploitation of the highest order. And of course that's why the Luddites arose, to oppose that. So that was, when I got there in 1958, you could still feel that vibe. It was a tough world, a northern working class world with a lot of simmering violence, because if you stick people in these ghettos, of course people were white, they were Anglo-Saxon, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, most of them, but they were the people who got the very short end of the stick. So that's the world I grew up in, really, without any sense of a deeper spiritual reality, surrounded by a certain grimness, with the presence of war and Holocaust. And I used to come back home on a Friday night and there'd be a show on The Great War. It was a British TV series, ran for 24 weeks, and week after week it would be these images, these haunted, hollow-faced men trying to psych themselves up to go over the top in the trenches, straight into that barrage of machine gun fire and be mown down and caught on the wire. So it was a world of, I couldn't wait to leave. They did have one shining grace. And of course that was the Beatles. Thank God the Beatles came along, because it still blows my mind, really, that they came out of a comparable grim existence. I once found myself stuck in Liverpool renewing my passport, and so we took a magical mystery tour with a bloke who'd actually grown up with them. And if you actually see where the Beatles grew up, there were 4 pubs within 100 yards of where George Harrison took his first breath and so on. It was exactly this world that I'm describing, really, very similar. Liverpool was 80 miles down the road from where I spent most of my teenage years, but it was that same vibe. And to think that the Beatles came out of that with the music and their spirituality, and of course the psychedelic thing that contributed to all of that, and the way they pointed the world towards love and meditation and India and all of that it's really one of the most stunning things for me. But then, you know, I did finally get out. The only routes out of that world were, you know, the military or sports or academia. So I took the academic route. I got out, which wasn't that easy to do in those days. I went to a university in England, it's called Sussex University, which was intended to break the stranglehold of Oxford and Cambridge. It was the first of the new universities, so it was like swinging London. Some of us here are old enough to remember that world. So it was rock and roll and The Who and miniskirts and Jimi Hendrix at the Student Union and all that kind of thing. And it was great. It was a huge liberation for me from that grim, grimy world. But when I finally got to philosophy, and I got to the philosophy department, and I thought, yeah, you know, look, we're really going to study philosophy now, this is cool. I walked into that philosophy class, and what did they hand me? They handed me A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic. I don't know how many of you have had the misfortune to... Does anybody read that at CIS? Thank God, I hope not. But I mean, A.J. Ayer was the Oxford Professor of Logic at the time. He was considered the apex of philosophical acuity in the Anglo-American world, and logical positivism was the most absurd philosophical dead end that anybody could imagine. These people were totally into petty linguistic pedantry. So they would take a phrase like, what is the meaning of life? And they would analyze it with such intense semantic linguistic rigor that they arrived at the conclusion that the question could not be posed. It was a meaningless question. I mean, in other words, it was just a ridiculous dog biting its own tail absurdity. It was a complete philosophical dead end. I was furious. I remember being in a line at the so-called refectory, which is what they call the cafeteria there, and there was a guy in front of me who had just been given it too, and he said he picked up that thing and he threw it against the wall. And to me, that has remained to this day the wisest approach to logical positivism. Ironically, our Wickham Professor of Logic at Oxford, A.J. Ayer, actually had a near-death experience later in his life and renounced all his philosophical material and actually turned into a decent guy. All his family said he actually became a much nicer person as a result. But he said that, and I don't think anybody today takes logical positivism very seriously. Do we have any philosophers amongst us? I mean, I'd be amazed if anybody does. But this was what was on offer. I mention it because when I finally got to the halls of the philosophers in 1967, and nobody was at home. It was a dead end. But, of course, we had this whole big counterculture starting to surge. The life, the vitality, the music, you know, Fleetwood Mac playing down the local pub for the equivalent of 75 cents a night, and so on. And that was fabulous. I mean, I must say that was a huge source of invigoration. That did get me through those years. But then, you know, because I did a degree in American studies in Britain, and that was very rare at the time, I thought, well, you know, I really should come to America to check it out. I can't really do a degree in it without knowing anything about it or being there in person. So I did. And that's what got me to America. I didn't know a soul on the continent. But I was in Chicago, but Christmas came at the end of the first semester. And I was thinking, I gotta go to California. This is the cusp of the 60s and 70s. Everybody wants to. I wanted to go to California. So I answered an ad for a co-driver. Driver needed to drive to LA down Route 66. And it turned out to be somebody who had been trying for months and months to get a co-driver. Nothing worked. She was going to move to Hollywood and be a screenwriter in Hollywood and all the rest of it. And anyway, we met, we clicked, boom, and we set off down Route 66. And of course, for me, the first track of the first side of the first album of the Rolling Stones was Route 66. So if you ever plan to motor west, taxi my way. take the highway, that's the best. Get your kicks on Route 66. So that's what I did. So, you know, actually in the book I've had to credit these songs that I included. I'm afraid I'm glad that I do love that quote from Goethe, but I'm afraid we don't have any Goethe or Shakespeare. we've got Route 66, that's written in 1945, I think, and then we have the other song that was really the theme song for my youth in the north of England. We got to get out of this place. And I remember that song by the Animals. We got to get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do, we got to get out of this place. Girl, there's a better life for me and you. So I went from we got to get out of this place to getting my kicks on Route 66. And, you know, it turned out she was an astrologer, she did my charts, she said this is going to be the best month of your life. I was skeptical at the time, but she was absolutely right. And here's the amazing thing, one of the many synchronicities that apparently my life was involved that I didn't notice, but people read the book and they can't believe all these synchronicities happen. But just the very day I got this book in the mail a couple of weeks ago from the publisher, I got a Facebook friend request from the woman that I traveled down Route 66 with in 1970, who I hadn't been in touch with for 18 years. So there's something mysterious going on in all of this. But that trip down Route 66 for me, it became a spiritual journey. It was the starlit skies, the huge empty silence. You know, those deserts down there are on a different order from Europe. Europe is fundamentally smaller topographically. I can remember pulling over to the side of the road and just hearing, it was as if you could hear the earth turn in the spheres. And, you know, all the way down Route 66, My Sweet Lord was coming out. And when we got to Tucson, All Things Must Pass, one of the great albums of all time, had just been released. And so that was for me. Here I remember hearing the pure sound of silence on the site of some 14th century Native American ruins in the Painted Desert. And so that for me began a whole spiritual transition. I realized that a lot of my attitudes had come from me closing down personally. I had shut down, you know, my own defensive reaction to growing up in difficult circumstances. And, you know, the reason I wasn't getting a lot of nourishment from the universe was that I wasn't open to it. And I began to realize that there was a huge amount of freedom that lay with me to actually start to open a bit to the world that was around me, start to connect with the heart, start to tune into those vast cosmic stars. I've always had this connection to the stars. You know, you look out there, and then you learn that some of these tiny little specks in the sky, they're not just planets, of course, nor are they suns, they're not even solar systems, nor are they even galaxies. Some of the tiniest specks in the visible universe are galaxies of galaxies. And yet here we are walking around on this little planet in a corner of the Milky Way, and we think we've got it all figured out. We didn't even know about electricity 150 years ago. So all of that, you know, being under those starlit skies at night began to awaken in me a sense of being part of a much deeper, more magical, transcendent, and mysterious reality. And so I had that trip, that month I took out there going west, was a real spiritual turning point for me. I began to open to spiritual levels of reality. And then I went through a kind of thing that many people express, where books, they wouldn't exactly fall off the bookshelf right in front of you, but I'd be walking in a bookstore in Chicago and suddenly a book would be sticking out 3 or 4 inches from the bookshelves, and it would be Radhakrishnan's Eastern Religions and Western Philosophy. I'd imagine that's the kind of book people read here at CIS, isn't it? No, I see some black law. Anyway, I love that book, and the first 40 or 50 pages of that just spoke to me perfectly. They described exactly where I was, what had happened. I began to see some coherence, but still how did I reconcile the intellectual, political side of me that had grown up with a sort of progressive, leftist orientation? One thing my father and I never disagreed about was politics. My father was a lifelong Welsh socialist. He believed in the abolition of the monarchy. He believed in, you know, we should give all the money to poor widows and orphans that presently goes to the monarchy. But I'm not sure I'm willing to go that far yet. But he and I were always on the same page around that, although not on the same page spiritually. So how to reconcile that progressive, leftist, political point of view, social justice, with this growing spiritual awareness, doesn't it? If you look at the British progressive press to this day, like The Guardian, I've been reading The Guardian since I was 11 years old, because my father subscribed to it. Now people here read it because of the web and so on. But if you look at The Guardian, you'll never find anything spiritual. Well, we're starting to get little glimpses of it. Nothing holistic. It's out of that British leftist progressive tradition. It's the oldest progressive newspaper in the English-speaking world. It comes out of the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester in 1820 or something like that. And yet it's only just beginning to open to the spiritual. Over there, it's very hard for people to put the spiritual and the political together if you come from a progressive point of view. So for me, it was, I had such overwhelming experiences on that journey down Route 66, and then so many spiritual openings during the remainder of that year, that I felt, look, I've got to devote myself full time to the exploration of spiritual, mystical, and esoteric truth. Because if these experiences that I'm having are real, then nothing could be more important, and nothing could be more significant than to investigate them in depth. And that's what I decided to do. Graduate school really wasn't speaking to me, because these kinds of books that were coming to me weren't being covered. I mean, I don't know where was CIS? Did it even exist in 1971, or did it just started or something? It was very small at that time, or all the other progressive colleges in California too. These are very early days. So it just wasn't out there. You know, if you wanted to pursue this more mystical and spiritual point of view, you really had to leave. At least I did. I mean, there was just nothing that was speaking to me. And set off on my own journey. For me, that involved moving to the West Coast. It was Canada, because Vietnam was still raging, and I didn't have a green card, etc. at that time. So I moved to Vancouver, which is, as you know, was at the time kind of Canadian San Francisco, and that's where I immersed myself really in the mystical and spiritual realm. And I remember there was a tiny little hole in the wall, a little bookstore that had just opened up literally a few months before I got there. And I didn't have any money, I didn't know anybody in Canada, but I would go into this little bookstore called Banyan Books. It was literally just one room, but it was surrounded by pictures of different holy men. It was, the air was perfumed with incense. You didn't have to buy anything, because I couldn't afford any books. You could just sit there and read for hours and hours, day after day. And that little place, Banyan Books, was a complete lifeline for me. This is 1971. And here's a sweet thing in terms of the karmic turn of the wheel. On this book tour, when I go up to Vancouver, Banyan Books is now, and has been for decades, the largest consciousness bookstore in Vancouver, and they're doing the whole thing for me. And so that's a really sweet turn of the karmic wheel, because back in 1971, I thought, I'm crazy. I left graduate school. I don't know anybody. I have no money. This is madness. Am I on the path to psychosis, or am I on the path to enlightenment? Is there any difference between the two? I really wasn't sure. So that little place played a massive role for me. And then here I am going back there in a few weeks as a kind of guest of honor. So that is so sweet. It just goes to show there's something to all of this. But coming back to this question of how could I reconcile my spiritual and my intellectual sides, as it were, and for me the answer was very simple, and it was really Carl Jung. I remember when I was 22, Modern Man in Search of a Soul by Jung was huge to me. For me, it meant more than Freud and Marx put together at that time. Because it was Jung's concepts of the collective unconscious, the fact that mandalas, should we say, can appear in every culture all over the world, or many cultures, regardless if there'd been any actual geographical connection or not. The whole notion of individuation, that we're seeking to make ourselves whole from multiple different directions. Not to mention the shadow, because having an upbringing like mine, you have to be very aware of the shadow. And so I could never go for a more, what should we say, a more smiley-faced view of reality, the kind of new age of every day, every way, things are getting better and better. I always have had to be attuned to that darker side of reality, which is my own destiny has led me to do things like the Open Center in New York. Of course, well, the conventional wisdom when we started that 30 odd years ago was get out of here. This is New York City. It'll never work. Maybe California, Hawaii, Colorado would have pushed, but this is the real world. New York needed one, it already had one. That was the attitude back in 1982, but we did it anyway. And 300,000 people later, we can say that it's worked pretty well so far. So I really went up there to the West Coast there and to Vancouver to really immerse myself in this exploration of deeper spiritual truths. And it began to come together for me on a consciousness level. I began to see ways to reconcile these hitherto irreconcilable parts of my own psyche. But then one day I was sitting in Vancouver in a friend's house, watching the TV, and a picture of Machu Picchu came up. I thought, Machu Picchu? Wow, here I am, a relatively educated person for my age. I don't even know that I've seen an Aztec and an Inca. What are these strange, mysterious cultures and civilizations that we've been neglecting? I mean, today, everybody, even my sister who's a total homebody, even she's been to Machu Picchu. I mean, everybody has been there today, or not everybody, but a lot of people. But back in 1972 or 71, it was a rarity. And of course, many people have traveled overland to Asia through Afghanistan and Iran and so on, and done the old hippie trail. I wanted to do something that was new. So I know ever since I started hitchhiking when I was 16, because that was my ticket to freedom there in the north of England, getting out of that grimy industrial northern world, was just to stick out that thumb when I was 16 years old. And I can still remember when that first truck pulled up, that rush of energy up my spine. Today we'd say it was some kind of kundalini rush, but whatever it was, just this huge rush of ecstatic energy right up the spine, through the crown of the head. Because in those days you had a lot of guys who'd been in the military in Britain who'd pick you up and give you rides, so it was easy to hitchhike all over the place. But I always wanted to stick my thumb out and hitchhike till the end of the road and just keep on going down there, down the Pan American Highway, all the way down through Mexico and Central America, and then I had to fly a little bit over to Colombia, and then to hitchhike to Machu Picchu, which I did. And now today, everybody knows about Vision Quest. I never heard of a Vision Quest. I just wanted to hitchhike to the end of the road. But I was also interested in what were these ancient cultures. So, of course, I was going to all these places, Teotihuacan outside Mexico, and different places in Oaxaca. And but when I did finally get to Machu Picchu, it took 6 months. But it became clear to me there that there are certain sacred spots on the face of the earth. Now, some of them might have temples on them. In those days, 40 odd years ago, everybody thought that Machu Picchu was supposed to be, well, Western scholars thought it was a fortress. Anybody who's been there can tell it's a sacred place. There's a magnificent, exquisite quality about it, and I was there, and the clouds came down. You're at a mountain top, you're surrounded by higher peaks. The clouds came down and formed this beautiful lilac covering to us. It was total silence. There was nobody else there at the ruins. You could hear it was pure silence, except thousands of feet below you could hear the rushing of the Urubamba River. And then you'd see a lightning flash and see the Temple of the Moon up above. And it was just pure magic. And I began to see, there are sacred places on the face of this earth. And certain cultures have been very sensitive to them, and the Incas were certainly among those. And then later on, going over to Lake Titicaca and the little village of Copacabana, which the beach in Brazil is named after, but up there on Lake Titicaca, watching the shades of the lake change as the light faded, from turquoise to blue to indigo with these scarlet clouds around the horizon. I realized, inner serenity, you spend that amount of time up there in the mountains under the stars with the indigenous peoples, and a certain awareness seeps into your consciousness. And I only realized how powerful it was when I hitchhiked a ride in the back of a pickup truck down to sea level again from the Andes down, and even getting down to a relatively small Peruvian city, Arequipa. I saw Western industrial civilization with fresh eyes after months in the mountains under the stars. And I just took one look at it, and it was one of those moments of intuitive knowing, where you completely get it just like that. And I saw Western industrial civilization, and I saw that it is destroying the planet and that it is really corrupting our souls, and that we have to create an alternative. And so I would say that insight that came to me in the back of a pickup truck when I was 24 years old really served as a guideline for me, because that's a lot of what I've devoted my life to, is creating some kind of an alternative. And so that, I'm going to have to skip a few bits over here, but that's what then led me. I came back, I wound up living a year in Colombia, which was, that's a great place to be when you're 25 in Bogota. But I did go and see, I always remember going to see a wise Chinese doctor who was down the peninsula somewhere when I got back from that year in Colombia and nearly 2 years in Latin America, and he felt my pulse, and he's one of those brilliant Chinese diagnosticians who could tell you how long it was since you'd had a cup of coffee and so on. And I can remember he laughed. I wonder if he's still alive. What a wonderful man he was. But he laughed, he chuckled, and he looked at me, he said, "You carry on living like this," he says, "you take 10 years off your life." And I thought, yeah, that's about right. But that's what, if you were 24, 25 years old, and you were a young male, you needed to push yourself in a way. That was my Bogota for me, was the counterpart to being in the trenches and the war of my father and grandfather. You know, you have to have that experience where you push it to the edge and you really find out who you are. But then for me, having come back to California after that, one day I was up visiting a little embryonic Sufi community up in the Napa Valley before Napa became so developed. And one day in there I came across this book called Findhorn, A Center of Light. It was a little 50, 60 page pamphlet by Paul Hawken, and it was about this place in the north of Scotland, an emerging community. And I also came across the same time a book by John Michel called The View Over Atlantis, which was all about the whole ley line system all across Britain and the sacred places. Everybody knows Stonehenge and Avebury and places like this, but there are actually these straight lines that run all across the British landscape. And anyway, it generated in me the feeling, yeah, you know, I'm going to go back. It's time to go back to the country of my origins, and I can find things there that are just as deep, just as mystical, just as mysterious as in the deserts of the Southwest or the Andes or wherever it may be. Right there, it's a deeply engaging culture. And I thought, so anyway, I thought I'm going to check out this place, Findhorn, so I did. So I actually wound up, so for me, the first part of the book is called The Quest. So it's really what I've been describing to you mostly, my own personal journey. But then the second part of the book is the work. Because, okay, you've gone on the quest, you've been on a quest for meaning, you've arrived, or in my case, you've arrived at a conviction that we have to create a different culture and a different society based upon holistic, ecological, and independently, freely spiritual values. How, then, is to do that? What is the strategy? What can really be achieved? How do we take it from just an internal, personal resolution, shall we say, to making a difference? And so for me, that began with really deciding to spend some time at Findhorn. Now today, it's, I'm sure have you heard of it? Many of you, or some of you have heard of it. You know, it's up there in the north of Scotland. It's a long way north. It's on the same latitude as Scandinavia, all the way up there. And it is, it has the vibe of the old Pictish culture that was there for many centuries. But for me, that was a very nourishing experience. It was a healing experience, because as I described, maybe I'll read a little bit from when I arrived at Findhorn. In fact, no, maybe I was wondering what to read. Maybe I'll try to read a bit of that. Yeah. Okay. Part 2, the work, Chapter 6, Findhorn, Northern Scotland. The heart expands, the soul finds community. New Year's Eve, 1975. In the snowy darkness, my train pulled up at Forres Station in the north of Scotland, and I stepped onto the platform in this remote world far from the warmth of California. My old friend Simon, veteran of Colombia and the Andes, was there to greet me. He and his wife Ellen had visited this spiritual community based on an attunement to and love of nature, and had sent back glowing reports. We drove along winding country lanes toward the small village of Findhorn, passing a strange ancient standing stone by the side of the road, and in the biting wind pulled up in front of a low building known as the community center where dinner was being served. I walked inside and took off my coat. A pair of swinging doors blocked my view of the interior, where it appeared from the buzz of good humor that most of the community members were present. I walked towards them and entered the dining room. Immediately, I experienced a feeling that warmed my heart, and that I still remember vividly almost 40 years later. But I know half these people. I had never laid eyes on nearly all of them before, but my sense of comfort and familiarity was instantaneous. And thus began a saga that in one sense lasted 3.5 years in northern Scotland, but that in other ways was to go on for 25 years as I worked to create and maintain centers of light in Findhorn language, or places where a new consciousness could emerge. On that snowy Scottish night in the mid-70s, I could never have guessed that my path would take me from this distant northern outpost on the edge of the Moray Firth to the heart of downtown Manhattan via the hills and valleys of upstate New York. Findhorn in the mid-70s was a very special place. Entering the community, it was as if you passed through a semi-palpable wall of love into a realm possessing some of the charm and beauty of Tolkien's Rivendell. It had all begun in 1962 when Peter and Eileen Caddy and their Canadian friend Dorothy McLean found themselves out of work and money living on a caravan site. That's a trailer park. They'd been pioneers in the post-war British spiritual movement. Eileen and Dorothy had developed remarkable meditative powers, and Peter translated into action the inner guidance received from the two women. What came to them in contemplation was that this unlikely caravan park was to become a world-famous community to which people would come to create a center of light, demonstrating that it is possible to live together largely harmoniously in a state of loving community attunement to nature. It must have taken remarkable faith to believe that any of this could possibly come true. Before the psychedelic era and the Beatles had opened up a widespread interest in meditation and spirituality. Yet when I arrived 13 years after that first beginning, the place was thriving and hopping. Ever since David Spangler, a young and brilliantly gifted American spiritual teacher and writer, had come to Findhorn at the beginning of the 70s, the place had been transformed from what must have appeared to outsiders as a small group of a dozen or so aging English eccentrics into a vibrant international community filled with energetic young people, bursting with idealism and dedication to a new spiritual vision. This was the group that greeted me as I crossed the threshold to the community center on that snowy New Year's Eve. They were from all over the world, but the largest contingent apart from the Brits was American, and they exuded that genuinely fine American quality, can do. And of course that's what they did. A lot of Findhorn was built by American ex-hippies. It was sort of a post-Californian world back there in the mid-70s, and that was a beautiful experience for me in many ways. It had its downside, you know, it wasn't as exciting as hitchhiking to Machu Picchu, but just to live with a community, to live with a sense of meditative attunement, with an awareness, cultivating a sensitivity to the spiritual forces that live within and behind nature. That was a very special experience for me. So I was there for those years, and then I left there, and to cut another long story short, I then wound up really being involved in getting Omega Institute off the ground. You know, I don't know, I never know out here in the West Coast. People have heard of Omega Institute, have they? It's a kind of the East Coast Esalen now. But when I was, maybe I'll read a little bit from what those early days of Omega were like, because I think very few people have that sense I call it Chapter 7, Omega Institute Holistic Learning's Early Years. Well, at least the early years on the East Coast, anyway. Let's see what I can find here. Let's see, am I reading the right chapter? No, sorry, no wonder I'm reading the wrong chapter here. Oh, how can that be? Oh, it's because the Omega chapter is a short chapter. Omega has since become widely known in the eastern United States, but there was nothing glamorous about the job of program director when I took it in 1981. As Omega was originally an outpost of the Abode of the Message Sufi community founded by Pir Vilayat Khan, that was housed in a former Shaker village, its winter offices were located in the small town of Lebanon Springs nearby. Never in my life, not even in Huddersfield, have I ever been so bored. During that relentless freezing winter of 1981, every evening after work I trudged in deep snow from our small office next to the post office to my cold and drafty apartment, which I shared with a young single mother and her frequently crying baby. We were all working for a pittance. My girlfriend had returned to Los Angeles and I could only afford one long-distance call to her of an hour each week. Hemmed in by the snow-covered hills with nothing but a grocery store and a dull bar for entertainment, there was nothing to do but watch television or read. Our tiny black and white set could only pick up one channel, so after the evening news we were doomed to yet another showing of Family Feud. I knew this existence was starting to take its toll when Richard Dawson, the show's host, began to appear to me as a kind of Zen master. It was time to get out of there when I knew that was going on. The nearest town was the very aptly named Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And the trip to its supermarket became the high point of my existence. The going had indeed become rough. There were, however, compensations. My colleagues and I had a whole summer to fill with innovative programs, and America was bursting with new spiritual teachers, fresh psychological techniques, innovative approaches to bodywork, and a growing awareness of the value of alternative medicine. Shamans were emerging from the jungles of the Amazon. Lamas appeared from remote monasteries in the Himalayas. Therapists were exploring the transpersonal dimensions of the psyche. African and Indian ritual dancers were starting to share their art forms. Major honoraria were almost unknown in those days. So many teachers worked virtually for free. I could see from previous correspondence that my Sufi predecessors had addressed faculty as beloved one of God and signed their letters in the light of the One. The noble idealism of the 70s was still in the air, and teaching on holistic topics had not yet become a growth industry. The lure of big money that poisoned the 80s and changed the way holistic centers operated was still to make an impact. The first yuppies had just been sighted, and few people imagined their values would become a prolonged fixture of the American scene. As the scheduling boards filled up, a new problem asserted itself. Suddenly, we were without a home. As the printing deadline approached for the summer catalog, this was becoming serious. And then we discovered Camp Boiberich, a formerly Yiddish-speaking family camp near Rhinebeck, an hour and a half north of New York City. I saw it first, one snow-covered day with leaden skies, 86 buildings on 108 acres, almost all of them neglected, many with collapsed and leaking roofs. A stench emanated from the kitchen where the previous owners had abandoned many cans of food that had exploded in the summer heat. I yanked open the half-rusted door of the pantry and found myself staring at a large rat up on its hind legs, its yellow teeth exposed. I slammed the door fast and sighed. Would it be possible for a single decent meal ever to emerge from a place like this, let alone to run a program serving thousands of people? Upon further investigation, we discovered that it took roughly half an hour for hot water to make its way from the aged boiler to the furthest cabins. How would that go down with demanding New Yorkers? At least at Cluny Hill, that was Findor, there was a community of hundreds to assist in the cleanup and renovation. Here we had a year-round staff of 7 or 8, and the task was equally, if not more, formidable. I began to have fantasies of participants en masse demanding their money back, and the whole summer becoming a total fiasco with me as the front man. Just my luck to become program director in the midst of a crisis. On top of this, I didn't really know what a summer camp was, having grown up in Europe. An old comical hit record I knew from the early 60s. Hello, Mother, hello, Father, here I am at Camp Granada began to play in my head, and with all its evocation of adolescent horror. But the alternatives were few and equally risky. So that's just a little sense of the beginnings of Omega, which of course has been very successful many, many years now, and then the Open Center, which is a whole other chapter, because as I mentioned, starting the Open Center back in '83 when I began working on it, I figured it would take us 9 months to launch it, so we did launch. I had an insane year in '83 where I was running the programs of both Omega and the Open Center and driving back and forward between the two. But if you're going to be 34 years old, that's a good place to do it with all that youthful vitality. And yet here we are. The Open Center's been going now for all these years, and although it's never easy, and who knows what will happen next year. But it's been, it has been spirit in the city. It has been deeply fulfilling, and to do it, it's one thing to do the retreat centers that are out there in the rural environment. I can remember at Findhorn, people have wonderful transformative experiences, but then they would think, oh, but then I've got to go back to the real world, that dreary world of everyday consumer capitalism and wage slavery, and they'd think, oh, I've got to leave and go and do that. So, but here, the Open Center was already in New York, and that could, we were already there. So there's a whole chapter on that. I do want to, there are other aspects of the book too, because I wanted to make it entertaining. I didn't want to write some leaden tone on consciousness that would be an effort to plow through. So I do, there is there's the Hitchhiking Tibet, there is I did another experience I had when I was staying in the monastery of the State Oracle of Tibet in Dharamsala. I spent a month in the State Oracle there, and at the end of that month, it's a working oracle, it's the last remaining political oracle that we have in the world, to my knowledge anyway. And twice a year the monks invoke Peha Gyalpo, the Nechung Chogyam, the protective deity of Tibet and the Dalai Lama, and I happened to be there when they were doing that. So I'd wake up in the morning, you would hear the monks chanting, the long thing, and then those great Tibetan horn trumpets being blasted in the cymbals. And so I asked if I could go and join them. There was only one other Westerner in the monastery. And so I went and meditated for 3 mornings with them as they invoked the deity. And at the end of that month in the monastery, the head monk came to me and said that they had some highly contraband material they needed to get into Tibet. And no Tibetan could do it because they were searched too closely by the authorities. And only a Westerner could do it, and they'd been waiting for the right person, and for some reason they thought it was me. So he asked me, he'd heard that I was going to take the first flight of the new year on April 1st from Kathmandu to Lhasa. And so I said, he said he'd put me under the protection of the Nechung Chogyam if I'd give it a try. And I figured, well, I'll give it a try, and maybe I'll be arrested at the airport in Lhasa, but they'll probably just throw me in jail for a few days and deport me. But it was the 30th anniversary of the flight of the Dalai Lama. This is 1989, so it's 30 years since 1959. And there were demonstrations and riots in the streets of Lhasa. And just for a monk to hold up a piece of cardboard with a crude Tibetan flag chalked on it would be enough to be shot at point blank range by the Chinese army or police. So anyway, so it looked like it was impossible to go because they threw all the Westerners out of the country and closed the borders. But then I met in Kathmandu, I met a guy, actually a Chinese-Canadian guy, who was the first person to go to Mount Kailash after Tibet opened up again. And he was writing a book on trekking in Tibet, he was researching it, and he had discovered a route that was last done into eastern Tibet in 1926. There was an Austrian-American explorer called Joseph Rock, and he'd written a series of articles for the National Geographic called Journey to the Land of the Yellow Lama. And these articles actually are speaking about the Lama kingdom of Muli on the southeast borders of Old Tibet. James Hilton, the guy who wrote Lost Horizons, actually read them, and he named Shangri-La about because he's the one who introduced Shangri-La into our vocabulary. So he named them after all those places after the Lama kingdom of Muli. So to cut a long story short, that's actually what I did. I wound up actually traveling across the eastern Himalayas on foot into the kingdom, what had been the Lama kingdom of Muli. This is the world of the Khampas. You know, we think of most Tibetans and we think of them as peaceable people or as monks. But the Khampas, who protected the borders of eastern Tibet for centuries, these are wild dudes. They all wear cowboy hats. The men have really long hair down here. They have big silver ornamentation in their long hair. They all carry swords. They're crack shots. They're some of the finest horsemen in Asia, said to be descended, some of them from Genghis Khan's troops. And I mentioned they all wear earrings. And as they say in there, a man without an earring will be reborn as a donkey. So I was sure to wear my earring when I was with the campus. So there's a whole story in the book about journeying into that world. And at the time, it was actually the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre. So when I got out of that, it was all forbidden country. When I got out, I returned to China in the aftermath of the massacre. I was concerned. I didn't see any Westerners. I thought I might be the only Westerner left in China. And I thought, how do I explain that to the Chinese, the people, the Public Security Bureau? But actually, when I got to Chengdu, I saw a handful of people who'd stuck around after the massacre. But that was like stepping straight into an Orwellian depiction of textbook totalitarianism. I will never forget that. And yet now I'm told, I don't know what you guys are hearing, but China's going through a kind of explosion of consciousness. Yeah. There's a massive interest in human potential. Jung has been widely translated. Waldorf schools, there was a big piece in the New Yorker about a year ago about how Waldorf schools are proliferating all over China. I met a guy who's starting a $40 million holistic learning center in Shanghai, who says that he has people coming to him from the highest echelons of the Communist Party saying, we've got to have an alternative. We have too many people jumping out of windows. There's such a pervasive sense of meaninglessness in China right now. You know, the older generation built the cities, you know, the massive economic boom, the huge global manufacturing center, etc. But meanwhile, the younger people, it ain't enough. They don't want shopping malls, or not all of them anyway. So the young people, unlike here, have money, and they have these deep existential, spiritual, psychological questions. And so actually, you know, I've been going to this thing, there's another thing that another chapter in this book is about the global network of holistic centers. See, I just came up from Mount Madonna, and I would have been at Harbin after this, and then I'll be up at Brighton Bush Hot Springs, and up at Hollyhock and the Haven in British Columbia, and so on. Most people don't realize that these centers are connected. We're friends. We're on a similar wavelength. We're part of a network. And in fact, the latest centers gathering is in China. I can't go because I have to do something else. But in 2 weeks' time, there's going to be a centers gathering at a newly emerging Chinese Human Potential Center, just 100 miles northwest of Beijing, within sight of the Great Wall of China. So that's going to be fascinating to see this time of political repression and economic insecurity in China, what is going on a psychological and spiritual level. But it's just a testimony to the fact that we're all the same. And we all have these same deep existential questions. needs. And in fact, well, there's a chapter in the book actually about Eastern Europe and Russia, because in the immediate aftermath of communism, I figured, look, there have to be a lot of people behind the so-called Iron Curtain who were on our wavelength. You know, one would hear rumors in the 70s of 10,000 Russian hippies rioting in Leningrad because somebody had canceled a Santana concert. But could it be true? Could it really be true? I figured it had to be true. Russia with its deep mystical traditions. So actually I spent a lot of time in Russia and Eastern Europe in the aftermath of communism in the early 90s, when you could fly in. I had to fly in with a money belt with $10,000. You couldn't send the money via the banks because they were totally controlled by the mafia. But in those days, $10,000 US was worth $100,000 in Russia. So you could see little embryonic holistic centers in Moscow and St. Petersburg and so on. And it looks like, of course, that was in the aftermath of communism, where the whole country was in chaos. Whereas what's it like now in China, a country that is still nominally communist? So that's another aspect of the book too. And I might mention a couple of other things, and then I want to open it up to questions. One of the things that I've really got into in these years at the Open Center has been, for me, I call it in this book, the rediscovery of the lost spiritual history of the West. In that one time, after a centers gathering in Germany, actually, I went with a friend to Czechoslovakia and stumbled across this forgotten little town in southern Bohemia called Český Krumlov. You know, we pulled up late at night. Nobody spoke English. She was German, so people could still speak some German. They spoke Czech, German, and Russian. That was it, not a word of English. And we pulled up at this little, old, mysterious town. I don't think I've ever been anywhere, or very few places in my life that had such a powerful aura of mystery about it. You know, it was dark, there wasn't a soul on the street. We crossed this old stone bridge under an archway. We turned a corner, started going down this cobbled street, these old dim yellow lights, empty. It's like I looked at her, she looked at me, what century is this? You know, we drove on, we turned another corner, suddenly there was an old wooden bridge. We crossed the bridge over a river and there was a huge castle rising up out of the river. I said, oh my God! You know, because it was behind the Iron Curtain for all those years, nobody knew anything about it. And we wound up staying in a 16th century building with huge, great casement windows, you know, walls this thick. And when we threw open the windows in the morning, there was a river, the Vltava river running down below. Birds were singing. I could see the castle in the distance. I thought, wow, what is this? And then we went downstairs to the breakfast room, and there were red roses painted on all the walls. And I thought, whoa. And then, I don't know how many of you have gone into the great historian Francis Yates, who was a reader in the history of ideas at the London University, the Warburg Institute, for many decades, great scholar. But I realized I had stepped straight into the pages of her celebrated book called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, because you don't normally put Rosicrucian and Enlightenment together in the same breath. But this is the whole world of late 16th, early 17th century Europe, Central Europe, when all these esoteric traditions were streaming forth. And she defines Rosicrucian as being a mix of Hermetic, you know, the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus as above, so below, so Hermetic philosophy, Neoplatonism, which had come back into Europe through the Academy of Ficino in Florence, Kabbalah, which had come up to Florence from Sicily, and alchemy. And so there was this whole beautiful culture that we'd almost completely forgotten. So I spent a few years saying to my Czech friends, you know, you're sitting here at a pivotal moment in European history, world history actually. But they had, you know, they'd have to put up with 300 years of the Habsburgs, and then the Nazis, and then the communists, and they did not have a can-do mentality at that time. So eventually I realized I'm the only way I'm going to get anything done is by doing it myself. And so I actually decided to create an event there, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment Revisited. I invited every single writer I admired in the Western esoteric tradition, and the amazing thing was, every single person said yes, even though nobody had ever heard of this obscure little town in the middle of nowhere. And Gnosis magazine described it as an esoteric Woodstock. That was a phenomenal experience. It was pure magic. I was just with somebody last night in Santa Cruz who was there. I'm still in touch with it's like the people I knew at Fendon all those years ago. I'm bonded with those people for life. Anybody who was in Chesky Krumlov in 1995 were bonded for life too. That was a profound experience. I remember walking up through these little cobble winding paths, and as I'm to the castle, and the full moon rises above the turrets of the alchemical castle. And I'm on my way to see Robert Bly give a reading in the old Renaissance room by candlelight on Rosicrucian and Sufi poetry. And at the end of that evening, the director of the castle opened up the private quarters of Count Wilhelm Rosenberg, who was a practicing alchemist in the 16th century, and his brother too, Peter Vogt Rosenberg. They were soul brothers of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who made Prague the imperial capital and had all kinds of alchemical procedures going on in the Hradčany Palace. And he was a Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, but his personal spiritual advisor was a Kabbalist. So those were the days. So I didn't know when I started that was 1995, that would turn into a 20-year series of conferences on the Western esoteric tradition. So that's the chapter in the book, Rediscovering the Lost Spiritual History of the West. Because, of course, I love all the Indian and Vedic and yogic philosophies, and the Buddhist and the Zen and the Tibetan and the shamanism and all the rest of it. I'm down with all of that. Of course, I couldn't have done the Open Center without it. But in the Western esoteric tradition, we have a tradition that has really been hugely neglected, and so we have to excavate it. It's a exercise in cultural and spiritual excavation. We've got to put it together again, because with the Inquisition, the reason it had to go underground for all those centuries was because of the activities of its enemies. And in fact, we just this last June, I just did an esoteric quest in the south of France. It was troubadours, Cathars, Templars, and the Grail in medieval Languedoc, and that was beautiful. I don't know how many of you know about the whole Cathar world of Gnostic Christians in the south of France. But you have to imagine in the 12th century, a highly sophisticated, very refined culture, the most sophisticated in Europe with the exception of Sicily at that time. And you think that these fairy tale castles built on mountaintops. I spent my childhood in Wales, which has more castles per square mile than anywhere else on earth, so I know a good castle when I see one. But I have never seen castles like those Cathar castles. Total fairy tale castles, absolutely perched on mythic mountaintops in the foothills of the Pyrenees. And this is a brilliant culture. They're Gnostic Christians. So they're not into faith, they're into gnosis. They're attuned to the Gnostic, even the Manichaean traditions, you would say. They believe in reincarnation. They're into the total equality of men and women. They reject the corruption of the church entirely. And they're contemporary with the troubadours. This is all happening in 12th century Languedoc. They're speaking Occitan, a language which was its own language, which was shared by Provençal, Occitan, Catalan. So this beautiful moment, we think, we've got to go to Tibet or somewhere, or India to find people who are into reincarnation. So no, absolutely not. A very sophisticated worldview there in 12th century south of France, and a culture permeated by love. Because before the troubadours, there was no romantic love in the West. So, of course, the troubadours would meet the Cathars as they journeyed between the towns and the castles. And who knew that the troubadour music, we can actually access the music and the lyrics of the troubadours to this day. I had no idea. And people are performing it now on the original instruments, and it's absolutely exquisitely beautiful. We think of troubadours as it's like Bob Dylan, going with a guitar on his back, etc. But those were not troubadours. Those were the jongleurs, the minstrels. The troubadours were actually a sophisticated, beautiful, refined culture. There were men, there were women, many of them were aristocrats, and really it was the northern troubadours, the trovards as they were called in northern France, the minnesingers as they were called in the German-speaking world, who actually wrote the tales of the Grail. So when you think of those great stories, Parsifal, the Grail Knight, and that all came out of the troubadour tradition, although in a more northern variation of it. And of course, some people would say, Rudolf Steiner, for instance, would say that those Grail stories were connected to a renewal of Christianity on a more esoteric level when it had descended to a certain nadir of corruption. It provided a model for the ennoblement of the human being and the refinement of the human being's spirituality. So the last thing I'm going to say is there's another chapter in the book, because I just felt I should do it, because he's been a big influence on me, and I just feel like it's somebody that, I feel like there's a treasure trove of esoteric wisdom that is still barely explored by so many of us, even those of us like all of us here tonight who have holistic and spiritual interests, and that is Rudolf Steiner. And you know, it's not everybody's taste, but I happen to have a real love of old Steiner. It was Steiner who got me into Goethe, that wonderful quote that Craig read at the beginning. And you know, I was just one day right at the beginning of the Open Center, I hiked the Nepali coastline trail. I needed to get away from it all. I was fried. I poured my lifeblood, my etheric vitality into creating the center. My energy was shot. I needed renewal. So I went as far as I could go, which was to Kauai, and hiked the Nepali. Has anybody hiked the Nepali coastline trail there? It's an old Hawaii. You have, yeah. So you know what it's like. You know, you cling to that trail out all the way there to Kalalau Beach, is it? That beautiful waterfall and so on. And then I hiked back. So I was gone way out there. And of course, Hawaii is the world's most remote archipelago. 3,000 miles in every direction to solid land. But when I got back from that, you know, my psyche was deeply attuned to the rhythms of the waves, the beauty, the vast horizons. I camped out in a little beach called Haina Beach one day, and it began to rain. I got inside my tent. I picked up a book on Zen. Didn't do it for me. And then I picked up a book by Rudolf Steiner called The Tension Between East and West that I'd bought in New York just the night before leaving for Hawaii, because I figured Hawaii is a good place to read a book called The Tension Between East and West. And I picked that book and I read the first 2 pages, and it was like, boom. I walked straight into a world that was just speaking exactly to me. And he's not everybody's cup of tea. I'm always surprised. You know, when I got into Steiner over 30 years ago, I always thought, well, we just have to put on some programs at the Open Center and it's all going to work out. Of course, this is a love that I share with Robert McDermott as well, who's done the Essential Aurobindo and the Essential Steiner. And so for me, I stepped into that world, and that has been a source of tremendous beauty to me. It's not a guru world. Steiner is very clear that he feels that we're living in an age of autonomy and freedom. For him, the 2 pillars of the human condition are love and freedom. So we're living in a time of freedom. And what he suggests is that when people look at Steiner and this massive treasure trove of esoteric wisdom that he's given us, that we think of him as a spiritual friend, not as a guru. So that's what he's been to me, just a wise spiritual friend. And we think of Steiner today as somebody who, you know, he founds the biodynamic movement, which is the renewal of organic agriculture in the 20th century. He founds the Waldorf schools, you know, which are now the world's largest independent approach to education. I mentioned they're now catching on like wildfire all over China. There are biodynamic farms all over India. It's not just middle-class educated people in the West doing this. It's really the biodynamic tradition is picking up where Gandhi left off in terms of working with villages in India. So, but you know, all of those things just came out of the last, last 4 or 5 years of Steiner's life. When he died in 1925, and people came to him in the aftermath of the First World War in 1919, and in the ruins of Europe, and they said, well, how do we renew education? And okay, well, glad you asked. And he gave a whole series of lectures that turned into Waldorf education. And then farmers could see then the desiccation of the soil that was coming through industrialized agriculture. They could even see the bees. Steiner predicted 100 years ago that we were going to have major problems with the bees unless we did something about agriculture. So he gives a series of lectures in Silesia on the renewal of agriculture that become the basis of biodynamics, and it goes on and on. But the real thing, you know, he gave 6,000 lectures, none of them the same, in over 350 books, because he didn't speak English, he never came to America. It's all translated from the German. He was Austrian, died in Switzerland. But The real thing is that for 25 years, from from 1901 to, I think he gave his last talk in 1924, for 23 years, he was non-stop. I mean, I have a hard enough time giving 6 or 8 different lectures. This dude gave 6,000, none of them the same. Often 4 or 5 the same day, even when he was ill towards the end of his life. I mean, there's a level of, I don't know what we can call it, genius. I think it's genuine genius. It's a level, the man had to be in touch with some kind of transcendent source to be able to, because even he would finish a lecture and go, whoa, you know, that's pretty good. I didn't know I knew that. I mean, except he would do it in his own Austrian way. He had a rather dry sense of humor, apparently. But I just wanted to turn people on to Steiner because I'm a fan of all the Eastern and other paths. But I think in Steiner we have a phenomenal genius whose brilliance is really awaiting rediscovery. It is a true treasure trove of esoteric wisdom. And for me, when I took that trip to Hawaii, you know, I'm glad I didn't come to encounter Steiner until I'd already explored multiple spiritual paths, because that's the downside with that worldview. People get into it too early and it can become a sort of inward, self-contained, you know, the Camp Hill village people, the villages for special needs children and adults that also came out of Steiner's work that are all over the world. They, you know, the Camp Hill people talk to the biodynamics, they talk to the Waldorf, and it's all one inward-looking family, noble and decent though the people are, but it's not connected to the larger spiritual stream. So I was fortunate that I had already immersed myself in many spiritual paths before I found this in my mid-30s. I couldn't have done anything. I could never have done the Open Center or Omega, you know, had I not had that experience. So anyway, I just want to recommend to you, if it so appeals to you, that is a beautiful realm. And I went to Hawaii that time because I was looking to deepen my esoteric worldview. And for me, and I already had a spiritual worldview, but I wanted a deeper esoteric worldview, and that you can really find the goods in there. For my money, when it comes to the journey of the soul between death and rebirth, you know, he considered himself a spiritual scientist. So these are not, from his point of view, not speculations, not theories. It's the result of actual research that he had the ability to do into the existence of higher worlds, into the journey of the soul between death and rebirth, into the nature of the subtle bodies of the human being, etc. So anyway, I threw a chapter in there because I just thought, I owe a lot to my man Rudy there. He's been a great friend to me over the years, and so I just wanted to turn some people onto it. So I think that's all I'm going to say. So I just want to open it up to any questions, remarks, comments, proclamations, whatever you'd like to say, and we'll take it from there. So. Peter.
So this has been in many ways a subterranean quest over all these years. Okay, this has been in many ways, it's working? A subterranean quest to recover aspects of the spiritual, transcendental potential of human beings that is otherwise covered over by these big thickets of alienation and, what did you say? Capitalist consumerism.
Yeah, consumer capitalism.
So, are you optimistic, or are we relegated to permanent subterranean? Are we emerging in some way across historical time?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, I would say, look, when the Open Center started, and I'm sure when CIS started 30, 40 years ago, the whole holistic worldview was totally peripheral. Certainly in New York, it was considered completely marginal. You know, the New York Times was still regularly writing op-eds, dismissing every form of alternative medicine as snake oil. Any kind of mystical worldview, like a Jungian worldview, was opening the doors to irrationality and fascism and really attacking it very nastily. You know, we know that the health food stores were just little mom and pop stores. We were crying in the wilderness about the need for organic agriculture and a green worldview. I mean, look how that has made its way into the culture. But on the other hand, we have all these regressive impulses as well. You look at all the different kinds of fundamentalism, whatever fundamentalism you care to choose, Christian, Islamic, Jewish, Hindu, whatever, wherever you find fundamentalism, it's always bad news. So you look at the fundamentalisms, you look at the primacy of economic values in all spheres, corporate globalization. If that's not the primacy of economic values in all spheres, I don't know what is. Look at all the grotesque forms of nationalism, make America great again, American exceptionalism, and look at what Steiner called the superstition of scientific materialism. The superstition that there is nothing other than this material world that passes itself off as solid, grounded, scientific, incontrovertible truth. So I think you have those regressive impulses at the same time, as well as the positive impulses. So the way I look at it, I just think we're in a struggle. I think we're living in a time where there's a real struggle for the soul of humanity. And I came to me one night in New York. I live in Long Island City, which is across from the United Nations, so just across the river. So you can look across and see the whole Manhattan skyline at night or at sunset. And I remember going down there to one of those piers one night, and it just came to me intuitively. I live in America, and particularly in New York, because it's the seat of the struggle for the soul of humanity. This is where it's still going down, where we have a lot of creative power, and though the outcome is still relatively uncertain, but hey, what the hell, I'm giving it my best shot. And so I don't think we can say there's anything guaranteed. I mean, we could have all kinds of grotesque developments that could emerge in the future. Look at Putin in Russia. Look how wonderful it was when Gorbachev was there doing that, and now we've got Putin. And God only knows what's going to happen in the US elections. But look at that. I mean, you've got these wonderful progressive politicians from my point of view, like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Then you've got that strange collection of characters over there with the Republicans, Donald Trump, but please. So what I loved about Donald Trump is that, people have been greeting him like a movie star, but then he came to Queens, which is where he was born. He appeared at the New York Open, the tennis championship. So he came back to his native borough, which is where I live, and thousands of people booed him from the stands at the New York Open. So I liked that, the homeboy was not greeted with any kind of accolade back, because of course you'd have to deport a third of the population of Queens if you were to go along with his policies. And even that, Queens, as I say at the end of the book, Queens, where I've lived for over 20 years now, it was considered the embarrassing borough in New York, just like Brooklyn used to be. Now we know Brooklyn's full of hipsters, etc. But Brooklyn, are you kidding me? I mean, when David Beckham named his son Brooklyn Beckham, I thought, that's a guy who really doesn't know about America. Who knew? He was ahead of the game. Now it's a cool name to have. But Queens, even Queens, that used to be considered I used to call people the closet queens, people who didn't want anybody to know they'd ever lived there or that they'd ever been born there. People were embarrassed to be associated with Queens. And yet, Lonely Planet just announced a few months ago that Queens is now the #1 destination for tourists visiting America because it's the most multicultural spot on the face of the earth. We've got the whole world in Queens. And as I say in the book, anybody who doesn't think multiculturalism works should just get on the #7 train out in Queens, and you'll see people from all over the planet, and we get along, because New York is barely recognizable from what it used to be like when we started the Open Center. But I think it's a very positive multicultural vision of the future. So I think that's the way we need to go. And I think there are all kinds of positive directions moving towards that, a multicultural, ecological, holistic future, and yet we've got all these other grotesque impediments. But maybe they're helpful hindrances, and they just require more of us to overcome. Anyway, I'm going to give it my best shot, and I think a lot of us, we're just, like old Keith Richards, he said he's just going to play till he drops. I think we're just going to keep on going till we drop. I'll probably drop on some esoteric quest. I want to do one on the Silk Road, one day. Or maybe we'll go to Iran, once now that things are looking a little more cheerful in Iran. The next one's going to be in Iceland, actually. I just was working on it before leaving here. We're going to do it next August. We're going to do an esoteric quest for the mysteries of the North in Iceland. I've been speaking to amazing people in Iceland. I was speaking to a 4th-generation esotericist, and wow, Iceland we have the opening night in a 9th century Viking longhouse that was built in honor of Ingolf Ingolf Firewolf, the Viking founder of Iceland. And of course, Lord of the Rings is filled, a lot of the names, Gandalf and so on, they all come from the Icelandic sagas. And Tolkien was hugely influenced by the Finnish epic, the Kalevala. So it's time to go into the Nordic vibe. We've done 5 esoteric quests in the south. The Golden Age of Andalusia in Spain, in Granada, Sufis, Kabbalists, Christian philosophers. As Craig mentioned, an esoteric quest for the mysteries of antiquity on the Isle of Samothrace, where one of the most ancient mystery centers existed from 600 BC to 400 AD for 1,000 years. The great mysteries of the great gods. Many of the most famous people from antiquity, Herodotus, the father of history, the Emperor Hadrian, many remarkable people. Alexander the Great's parents are said to have met while being initiated into the mysteries of Samothrace. So we did that one. Then we did an esoteric quest for ancient Alexandria, Greco-Egyptian birthplace of the Western mind, which we co-sponsored with the Library of Alexandria. They're the best partners we've ever had. And of course, none of us speak a word of Arabic. So we had to have they've rebuilt the Library of Alexandria. You know, of course, it's not the same as it was in the Ptolemy's day, but it's still a wonderful place, and they were great partners for us. Then we did Sicily, and then we just did Languedoc, and so we've done 5 in the south, and now we're heading for the north. And if it wasn't for Putin, I'd love to do Russia. We could do a great esoteric quest in Russia, and one day, if there's ever peace in the Middle East, we'll do one in Jerusalem too. So any other questions? Have I talked you all out? What time is it? Yeah. Well, have we had enough? Oh, I should say I did. As you'd be, I was supposed to have a whole bunch of books that should have arrived on Friday. They never showed up, and I was just down at Mount Madonna for a few days, and just an hour before I left, they miraculously showed up from UPS. So I've actually got some here. So if anybody wants some, I can actually provide them to you. Well, how did I get them?
No, how do we get them?
Oh, I'll just give you one. So, yeah. Well, yes, I see one more question. Well, that would be nice. Yeah.
I actually just have a comment.
Yeah.
So you said you're interested in Iceland.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful. Is this working?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. There's a wonderful community there founded on Rudolf Steiner's theory of reverse integration near Reykjavik. It's called Solheimar. I was just wondering if you had heard of that. I actually stayed there for a few months.
Oh, did you? What was it like?
It's well, the theory of reverse integration is about.
I'm not familiar with that theory.
Yeah, he had so many things, of course, Steiner. But it's about reintegrating people who have learning disabilities of some kind back into a way of society where they can
like Camp
So, but they also do like biodynamic farming, and it's a major reforestation center.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just thought I'd bring that to your attention.
I'm going to Iceland at the end of October, so I will learn. I'll know a lot more about it. But I like what I see so far. Very progressive place. And of course, they handled the financial crisis very well. They put all the bankers in jail, and refused to pay off all the debts. And now they have a booming economy. There's massive increase in tourism. You can fly round trip from Boston to Reykjavik for $380 now. It's amazing. So yeah, they're very smart people. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, the place is just like is a very unique. Sustainable community, that's the intention of it, of course, and half of the 100 residents have some kind of inborn disability, but they're given a place where they can thrive in a creative way.
Yeah, so that's like the Camp Hill villages for special needs children and adults that are literally on every continent except maybe Antarctica. Good. Do I see another? Yes. Please, far away.
Hi, Rob.
Hi there.
It's Annabelle.
It's Annabelle. Yeah, you're in the dark. I couldn't see.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm wondering when you wrote this book, what was the inspiration for it, and what was the impact that you hoped that the readers of the book would the transformation and the impact that people were.
Yeah, that's as they say, the proverbial good question. I felt in a sense, and that's what people have been saying to me since it came out. It is a kind of a story of a generation. Of course, it's my individual story, but it's more than just an individual story. It's a narrative of a certain time and place, a certain archetypal journey. So I hope that it would encourage and inspire people. I think, from what I'm talking to the young people who've read it so far, people who say are 29 years old and really want to do their creative work, but they came out of school with a massive debt, $150,000 worth of debt. So there's huge pressure on that generation just to conform, to get corporate jobs, to pay off their debts and so on. And so they have been telling me that it really provides a lot of inspiration and encouragement to keep on going and to not give in, to follow your own daimon, or whatever you want to call it, follow your own inner direction. So I'm really pleased to hear that it's having that impact on people. I think it's interesting to see the impact it's having, because I did a chapter on hitchhiking to Machu Picchu. The old hippies are saying, yeah man, I remember that freighter I took to Casablanca in 1969. So it's bringing up that. It's very interesting. I start off the book actually on a more poetic note. It starts off in Wales on a remote island called Enlli Island, the island of 20,000 saints at a sunset. It with me in a kind of mystical reverie because I wanted to invoke that for people. And we have a friend whose husband just died out of the blue a couple of weeks ago, like that aneurysm. Married for a year, looked like everything was great. Boom. Anyway, she's been telling me that reading that first chapter that is written in that more poetic rhythm is deeply soothing for her. So I'm actually finding lots of different reactions. So it's to tell the story. I'd be happy if in 100 years' time, if some researcher somewhere were to stumble across this book and say, oh, that's what it was like to live in this time and to be involved in this whole movement for whatever you want to call it, the expansion of consciousness, spiritual renewal, holistic ideas. There's so many different words for it. There's no real word that summarizes what it is. This is what it was like to be involved in this and to take this particular journey. So I think it tells a larger picture. It also, I thought, well, in terms of the early days of Omega and the Open Center, etc., people don't know about this. It's sort of just, nobody's ever really written a history of it. So I wanted to fill in that picture and just offer a story of immersion. That you can set out on a quest for meaning, shall we say, meaning and purpose, and you don't have to just succumb to materialism, consumerism, cynicism, whatever it may be. You actually can find some kind of meaningful path in which you can be of service to humanity and be of service in the awakening of consciousness. So I wanted to provide people encouragement, inspiration, and a laugh. And also, being a Brit, I'm not, the old stiff upper lip was pretty deeply ingrained in me. So I don't have a naturally self-disclosing nature. I'm not very inclined to reveal a lot of what I'm feeling, especially if it's of the more dark and wounded or depressed side and so on. But I made the decision in writing the book, it wasn't in the first draft, but when I did the second and third, it got in there more deeply, was to really include the moments of darkness. So when I was, let's say when I left graduate school and I wound up in Vancouver and I didn't know a soul, and I was trying to make a living selling Canada's first ecology magazine. It was called The Canadian Conservationist, and I'd have to go knocking on people's doors in Kitsilano in the rain and the snow, trying to flog them an ecology magazine, getting a lot of doors shut in my face, and coming away with at best a quarter. So, that was a very lonely time for me. When I was saying, was I really on the path to enlightenment or psychosis or just disintegrate? Who knew? I was following this inner vision. And to sit on those logs at Kitsilano Beach at night, looking out at the lights of the freighters bobbing in the harbor, the vast silent north, wondering where my next meal was coming from, wondering if my whole path made any sense, 6,000 miles from home. You know, I wanted to include moments like this, moments of doubt and pain, because I just thought it was helpful to people to see that. And what I'm hearing is that that's what people are interested in reading it. They don't just want a straightforward trajectory. Yeah, I did, you know, Finn and Omega, the Open Center, the Esoteric West, no problem, it was all a breeze. I think I wanted to give people a sense, listen, you go through rough times, you go through dead ends, you hit brick walls. There are times when you're lonely, depressed, isolated, you're wondering if it all makes sense, but you keep on trucking anyway. And sooner or later, with a bit of luck, it all works out. So I think that's what people want to read. That's what gives drama. You know, they want the story of struggle. So it didn't have to be a story about, you know, the endless memoirs about drug addiction and so on. I mean, I support people who've gone through all of that and come out of it, but I didn't feel the need to go into that level of difficulty and despair. But I just wanted to be honest emotionally about what I felt. And you know, when I left Findhorn before I went to Omega, and I was stuck living in California for a while, and I wound up picking pears and apples with Mexican migrant laborers in the Hood River Valley of Oregon because I was penniless. I thought I should, at one point I even wound up selling velvet paintings door to door in the suburbs of London. Now that I do rate as the nadir of this incarnation. There's never been anything as bad as selling velvet paintings door to door in London. I mean, I'd rather pick fruit in the Hood River Valley than do that any day. So I think...
Velvet native.
You don't know what a velvet... Oh, you're too refined and cultured a person even to know. Doesn't anybody know what a velvet painting is? They don't even have them in America. It's, you know, if you're in... This was London in 1971. I foolishly went back there because of an old relationship, which was actually shot, that I should have moved on from. But I wound up being stuck trying to get some money together, and it was either go back and teach, and I despised the educational system, and I wasn't willing to be part of that, so okay, I'll see if I can make some money flogging these velvet paintings. So you can tell you're in velvet country when you start to see plastic gnomes in people's gardens, and wagon wheels leaned up against the suburban porches. Oh, we're in velvet country here. So, you know, they actually were mass-produced things where they would just put a stencil over a piece of black velvet, and, you know, somebody with a thumb and a bit of paint on it would just... But, you know, then they would present it as like a Rembrandt, the Golden Helmet by Rembrandt, or some kind of nude. But, you know, I mean, people love this stuff. I mean, you'd show it to them, oh, I'll take that, mate, yeah, very nice. So, it taught me an important lesson, actually, because selling velvet paintings was something I had absolutely no courage for. I had no belief in it, and so I could barely drag myself out of the car and walk up to that door and ring the bell to proffer them this so-called set of original velvet paintings of the old masters. Whereas, you know, if I believe in something like doing that thing for Tibet in the Himalayas, I'm up for it. So it was an important learning for me. I've tried to, you know, put these learnings in the book, that zero courage for something I have no belief in, but I'll go for it if it's really important to me. But yeah, Peter, if you don't know what a velvet painting is, don't feel the need to educate yourself about it. You don't need to see a velvet painting. Nobody would rate that the artistic apex of the 20th century. It's crassness embodied. But that's why I rate it the nadir of my incarnation. Nothing's ever been that bad. Yeah. Well, and it's almost, it's getting towards 9 o'clock. So any last thing, or should we call it a night? I think we'll call it a night. So thanks very much for coming. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. My pleasure, Craig. And here, if anybody wants any, here's the review up here.
You take these up.
Ah, do we have that little square thing? I do have it, yeah.